Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. Welcome to a quick look at some of the best fantasy picks for Haru 2023. We've taken different approaches to making picks here, but this time we're keeping it simple. Our selections will be based on who's most likely to get a Kachi Koshi and who's most likely not to. One thing we know for sure is that there will be some surprise outcomes, so we're just trying to avoid the bad kind of surprises. Okay, let's get started. The number one pick is obviously Takakesho. He's the most dominant force in the sport with Teruno Fuji out, he's on a Yokozuna run, and he probably needs to smash the competition on his way to a Yusho to get the rope. Between his skill, his motivation, and the chances one or two guys will let up if they're losing so they don't get thrown into the 7th row, it's hard to see him getting fewer than 10 wins unless he gets hurt. Next are the Sekiwake, not because they're the highest ranks, but because they're also the safest picks. I leaned on Wakataka Kage for a while because he was the one guy you could be sure would get at least 8 wins, but now Hoshoryu and Kiri look just as consistent. Moreover, Waka has the worst head-to-heads against his likely opponents and the rest of the Sanyaku of the 3. Hoshoryu is slightly better than Kiribayama, but we also don't know how his ankle is or how it affected his training, so those two should be seen as about equally good choices. I think Waka is slightly behind them, but he's by no means a bad choice. If you need a Komusubi, Kota no Waka seems to magically get his 8 wins every Basho, but he's struggled more lately and looks like a guy who either isn't completely healthy, is trying to figure out what he needs to do to break through and ascend further, or maybe both. Wakamoto Haru is not quite as good, but he looks healthier and more ready to get it done. They're about even. Daisho, as always, is the most feast or famine pick. He's both the guy most likely to get 10 wins and to lose the most in the group. Tobizaru is legit, but he's just not likely to get the most wins of the bunch, and sticking at this level is still hit and miss for him. Takayasu is the obvious best pick of the Maegashira. If he can make it through all 15 days, he should get at minimum 8 wins, and probably 10. The only way a mostly healthy Takayasu gets less than 10 is if he smashes everyone around him, gets bumped up in competition in week 2, and isn't quite healthy enough to deal with them. But even then, he's probably winning 9, so he's still good. The other thing that makes Takayasu a good choice despite the injury risk is that there aren't many other obvious choices anywhere in the division. One thing I've noticed is that even though any guy can beat any other guy on a given day regardless of their head-to-head record, it's pretty rare for someone to string together 3 or 4 wins in a Basho against guys they've done poorly against in the past. Someone might start losing to a bunch of guys they've beaten in the past. Kotoeko's been guilty of this the last 2 tournaments. But suddenly popping off against guys you struggle against is much less common. This means some Rikishi who are tempting picks, like Tamawashi, look a lot worse when you see that he has pretty bad records against a lot of his probable opponents. It's not that he can't beat any of them, but he is likely to lose most of those fights. Even taking into consideration that he's generally strong early, and most of those fights should happen in the first week, he's risky. Okay, so who looks safer? In the Joy, which runs through Maegashira 4 West, Abi's the only one who has a solid record against his likely competition and isn't on the fade. Towards the bottom, Kinbozan and Hokuseiho are clearly the class of the Juryo promotees and should be expected to stay in the top division for a long time. They could slip in their first go, but considering how many Juryo regulars are piled around them, they should be expected to hit at least 8 wins. Kinbozan has been overall the more impressive of the two, but he hasn't done as well as Hokuseiho against his expected opposition, including Hokuseiho. He's 0-3 against him. I think if you have to bank on one or the other, go with Kinbozan since he's shown less vulnerability in his skill set, but it's hard to see anyone around them who looks definitively capable of doing better. Beyond those 3, going down from the top, we don't see anyone else who looks like they have a favorable lineup of opponents until rank 8. Somewhat surprisingly, Ichi Yamamoto looks pretty well set up. Of his 10 most likely opponents, he has winning records against 6. He's never fought Hokuto Fuji or Takayasu, but even if you consider him the underdog in those matchups, he has a pretty good chance of starting 5-5 or even 6-4. Considering that, for once, he can fight down in rank, not just up, he should be reasonably well positioned for 8 wins. Expecting more than that is optimistic, but it's still pretty good for a guy at a career-high rank. Ura also benefits from some favorable matchups. He has a winning record against 6 out of 9 likely opponents, including Takayasu. You can doubt him because he's only 2-1, but he beat Papa Bear in September when Papa was fighting Tamawashi for a playoff on day 15, so he can beat good Takayasu. He's never fought Hirotoumi, and that's probably a 50-50 matchup. He had a similarly favorable lineup in January and started 6-3. After that, he ran into some buzzsaws, but since we can't predict what those later matchups will look like, I would generally put good money on 6-3 Ura being able to hit 8 wins. Aoyama might not get wrecked, I'm not picking him, but I wanted to show I do know how to pronounce Aoyama, unless I'm still doing it wrong. Somewhat surprisingly, Myogiryu actually looks set up for a decent run. He's not bad against any of his likely opponents. The worst is Ichiyamamoto, who's 3-1 against him. The risk with him is that if he gets a rough start and fights down in rank, his world doesn't get any easier. The Juryo upstarts are waiting for him, as are Kotoeko and Tsurugisho, who beat him in January. But he could be useful in a game like Bench Sumo if you need a guy to sit between other picks and minimize the number of times your picks face each other during the tournament. On the other hand, where Myogiryu is pretty 50-50 against most of his opposition, Nishiki Fuji has what looks like some tougher matchups and some better ones. He beat Myogiryu for the first time in 4 tries in January, and they're set to match up on the first day. If you think he can repeat the feat, you may want to go with him instead. They might both do well, but I think that even in games where you could pick both, you might want to stick with one over the other. Kageaki is in a Myogiryu type of spot. Reasonably good matchups, but in a situation that could go south if he starts poorly. Since he'll have to fight Takara Fuji on day 1, and if Takara is going to get anything done, it'll be at the start, that's not a great way to begin. But after that, he's got a lot of guys who should be quite beatable, even taking into account that Kotoeko kicks his ass up and down now. He might be worth putting in a game where you need a lot of guys like Hoshitori. The last person I'll mention is Oho. I know he was a major disappointment and he probably looks really vulnerable with the monsters coming up from Juryo. Here's the rationale for thinking he'll do okay. If things go poorly, it takes him time to get back into it mentally. He'll have to fight Hokuseiho and Kinbozan the first 2 days, which certainly looks like a bad thing for a guy who appears to struggle with the mental aspect of the game. He's also god-awful against Mitoryu, which I currently have as most likely to happen on day 5. But if his worst matchups are early, then if he can avoid completely falling apart, he has enough better fights with which to come back and find his way to 8 wins. If you pick him, I think you have to expect a very rough start, and you're doing it in hopes he's on the upswing late. But there is a path to some success for him. The ones to avoid are pretty straightforward. Hamawashi is risky for reasons previously mentioned. Nishikigi is terrible against the Sanyaku guys overall, and now he has to fight all of them. Sado no Umi has been sailing along for a while, but his expected matchups are awful. Takara Fuji picked up wins in January for just long enough to hold on before collapsing at the end, and the competition just got harder. Bushozan doesn't do great against his expected competition, and he didn't make Makauchi on the back of any surprisingly impressive performances like Daishoho. He had 5 straight winning records in Juryo, and good for him, but in January he only beat one guy who finished with a winning record, and that was in Juryo. He might not finish with the worst record in Makauchi this time, but it's gonna be ugly. And between Chiyoshoma, Tsurugisho, and Mitoryu, maybe not all of them get clapped up and bounced down to Juryo, but it's really hard to see which of them is likely to stick. They all look like 7 and 8s waiting to happen. Okay, those are the general picks. Now let's see how they shake out into various fantasy games. Enjoy.